Hey, welcome back, guys. This is session number 23 of our exploration of the Gospel of Mark. In this session, we're going to finish up our time in chapter 6 with Jesus and the disciples back on the sea again. Yes, they're back, but we've skipped a couple of verses that I want to mention briefly. Jesus has just fed 5,000 plus people, and these people are excited about what he just done. And in our text, he's about to send the disciples off. But you have to remember that this is happening right after that miracle of feeding 5,000 people. So keep that in mind as we work through this passage. So, what are we waiting for? Let's go ahead and dive right into the text. Verse number 45 in chapter 6 says, "Immediately he made his disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side to Bethsaida, while he dismissed the crowd." Now, a lot of stuff happens on and around the Sea of Galilee. Here, Jesus does this. He makes his disciples get into the boat. Emphatic words in the Greek text. There's an urgency that is present here. Why is there urgency present here? Well, we just talked about it. He just fed 5,000 people, right? Now, it would seem after you get fed, I don't know about you, but I kind of want to take a good nap after that, right? Good food always requires a good nap. But this is where looking at other accounts of the same event helps you understand the account. So, John's gospel in chapter 6, verses 14 and 15, actually adds that people that he fed were looking to him to make him king and to do it by force. So Jesus actually wasn't trying to fit into their agenda for him, right? So immediately, the text says, right? Immediately, he was like, "You guys got to go. I'll take care of this crowd. I'll dismiss them because they are not going to try to make me king because I have another route to go about becoming quote unquote king of the Jews." Okay? So he felt that he needed to get the disciples out of there. So that's why it's emphatic here. He made them get into the boat. And where does he send them? Well, he sends them to Bethsaida. Now, the name Bethsaida means house of fishing. No surprise, right? It's right there on the water. We'll take a look at it on the map here in just a second. But it is the house of fishing. Beth is house. You'll see that in the Old Testament, a lot of Beths and Beths, right? It's always house, right? So Bethsaida is the home of Philip, Andrew, and Peter. Though we've already learned that Peter set up home base where? In Capernaum, right? And that's where Jesus has his home ministry, or in and around Peter's house in Capernaum. But they're all from Bethsaida, Philip, Andrew, and Peter. Now, where is Bethsaida in relation to the other cities that we've been discussing? Well, let's take a look at our trusty map here, okay? So we'll see Bethsaida here, right? It's right here on the northeast corner of the Sea of Galilee. And Capernaum is just east of there, right? It's like in the central northern part of the Sea of Galilee. So they had to travel east to get to Bethsaida, but they were traveling across the sea, right? So then, after he'd taken leave of them, that's Jesus, he went up on the mountain to pray. Now, let's look at this phrase here. He went up on the mountain to pray. Now, Mark has a theme in his gospel on prayer, and specifically the prayer of Jesus. And there are three things in Mark's gospel that we see in Jesus's prayer life. All the time that he prays in Mark's gospel, it happens at night. Whereas in other gospel, he does it in the morning. So whether you're a night person or a morning person, it's not about finding the right time. It's about actually finding the right time for you, right? Because Jesus did it at night. He did it at the morning. He was a morning person and a night person. I'm a morning person. So early in the morning works much better than for me. But Mark actually wanted to point out that he does this at night throughout his gospel, right? And he does it also in a lonely place, finding a place by himself to be able to pray. And then each of his accounts of his prayer finds the disciples removed from Jesus. Like they are not close to Jesus, right? And they actually fail to understand his mission, fail to understand, right? So, in each one of his prayers, he's trying to get discernment. I'll add a fourth one here, discernment in terms of next steps. Now, these people want to make him king, and he probably needs to go and pray and say, hey, I want to stay laser focused on the mission that you have for me. So he needed that time to pray. And one more thing about Jesus's prayer here that we can't miss, because last time we talked about who? John the Baptist and his death, and we kind of did it in passing, and John himself probably would have liked that because that's the type of humility that he has, right? But think about this. John is who? Jesus's cousin, really, really good friend. They were close. So when Jesus hears of that, he actually doesn't have time to mourn, right? Because immediately after John's death, Mark shows us that Jesus is feeding 5,000 plus people, all these people around him for his attention. And he learned about John's death a little bit earlier than that. So now we see him taking leave to go and process this, right? So I think if Jesus actually took opportunities to process events like this in his busyness, me and you, us in our busyness, actually are not above doing the same thing. Sometimes, to be honest with you, I feel like, I need to apologize to people for taking some time to grieve. Because why? Stuff needs to get done, right? But this passage just reminds me that it's okay to take time off, to actually grieve and to process things, right? And what's good enough for Jesus is really good enough for me and good enough for you. So here, I think he's also taking time to actually grieve over losing his first cousin in John. Like, that person was very important to him. He didn't really have that time to grieve. And even so, after taking this moment for himself, look at what happens next, right? And when the evening came, evening in Mark's gospel isn't always good. And when you see that, it's always an introduction to something that's about to be catastrophic or something that's about to be alarming, right? The boat was out on the sea, and he, Jesus, was alone on the land. So Jesus is standing over here. Sorry, stick figure Jesus. And he's in a boat on the sea while he's on the mountain from afar, right? Now, around this time, full moon's out because this is around the season of full moon. So he can be able to see the boat on the sea, right? And as he's alone and as he's praying, he's seeing this play out before him. And then what happens? He saw that they were making headway, the disciples, painfully, for the wind was against them. And about the fourth watch of the night, he came to them walking on the sea. He meant to pass them by. Some interesting things in this text that we want to look at, okay? The wind was actually against them, okay? The Greek word there is actually enantion, meaning the wind was whipping against them. And interestingly, every time the disciples are away from Jesus in Mark, they find themselves in trouble. As we've been working our way through Mark, think about it. Every time the disciples are out of Jesus's sight, they find themselves in trouble. I think that actually has some application for us. When Paul talks about remaining in Christ, there's this safety that you find in Christ. But once you find yourself outside of his presence, there's some trouble a brewing. And that's what's happening here in this text. There's this entanion that's happening, this wind that was against them. They were making headway painfully. They could not make it through this storm because they find themselves away from Jesus. But interestingly, he actually sent them away so that he could teach them a lesson in this moment, right? So what happens next? The fourth watch of the night. There I go again, forgetting my first letter. Sorry, guys. The fourth watch of the night, what happens? Well, let's talk about the fourth watch first. It happens between 3 a.m. and 6 a.m. So it's past midnight, early morning hours. And interesting thing about Mark, remember he's writing this gospel for what? Gentiles, right? So the fourth watch is a Roman concept. The Jews only had 3 watches, right? They divided their time into 3 different watches, but because he's writing to a Gentile audience, he talks about the 4th watch. And by this time, anyway, the Jews had adopted the Roman system of 4 watches, but historically, the Jewish system was actually 3 watches in the night. So this is between 3 a.m., 6 a.m. Jesus is up late praying, and they are up late experiencing this hardship. And he came to them, what? Walking on the sea. Now, this is very important, okay? Jesus is walking on the sea here. Now, as a Jewish person who's seeing this, something immediately pops to mind. And that is that only God, Yahweh, in the New Testament is seen as walking on the sea. You know, God had to actually split the sea for Israel because he's the God who actually walks on the sea himself. The people of Israel could not walk on the sea. They had to walk through the sea after it got split, right? But here we see that Jesus is doing the thing that only God does in the Old Testament. You can look at Psalm 77:19, which says, your way, God, was through the sea, your path through great waters, yet your footprints were unseen. Talking about Yahweh, God makes his way through the sea, walking on the sea. So as they are seeing this, they have to be thinking about what's going on in the Old Testament with Yahweh being personified as someone who walks on the sea, right? And then it says he was going to pass them by. I always thought that this was funny. I'm like, Jesus, are you like intentionally trying to like pass them without even trying to take care of them? But this language of passing them by doesn't actually mean that. It actually sounds familiar to the Jewish reader, which we are not. So we have to make that cultural bridge there. Why is it familiar? Well, because it appears a couple of times in the Old Testament again, going back to the Old Testament God, right? So you know how the Old Testament refers to God's glory passing by certain people? Happened with Elijah, right? Happened with Moses, right? If you look at Exodus 33:19. Also, there's a passage in Job that actually talks about this as well. It says that God alone stretched out the heavens and trampled the waves of the sea. He trampled the waves of the sea, right? He walks on the sea, right? So it wasn't that they were going to miss Jesus. I think that this text is actually meant to reassure them, right? Because when God's glory passes by people, right? When he passes by people, it's reassuring that I am with you, that my presence is with you, right? God actually used to pass by people in the Old Testament, Moses, Elijah, and others, right? In what theologians have called theophanies. Big seminary word that I'm teaching you, right? Oh, spelled that wrong. That's a theophanies. There you go. Theophanies are God appearances in the Old Testament. And those God appearances happen to actually reassure his people. So Jesus is doing the same thing in this text, which is why the next couple of verses make sense, right? But when they saw him walking on the sea, they thought that he was a ghost. Let's talk about ghosts right quick. Now, the Greek word there for ghost is phantasma, and you can probably see phantom there, right? But it actually means water phantom. So they were looking at a water ghost, right? So there was a Jewish superstition at the time that ghosts seen at night actually foretold two things: destruction and disaster. So you can know why they're afraid, because they see these 2 things coming to them in this ghost that they feel like they're seeing. But then something important happens here, right? For they all saw him and were terrified, but immediately, again, one of those marking words, right? He spoke to them and said, "Take heart, It is I. Now, let's talk about this phrase, it is I, because it's very important. One of the most important phrases in the New Testament that we want to sit on right now. Ego eimi, which means I am. Does that sound familiar? I hope it does, because if you look at Exodus 3:14, where Moses asked God, "Who do I say that you are when people ask me?" God says to him, "I am who I am. And tell the people of Israel that I am has sent me to you." So when Jesus says ego eimi, there are like 7 statements in John's gospel where he uses that phrase ego eimi. I am the bread of life. I am the resurrection and the life. He uses that same phrase, which makes him equal with God, which is why he can say, take heart, don't be afraid. More connections with the Old Testament here, okay? That reassurance, do not be afraid, happens all throughout the Old Testament. He always appears to people, God, those theophanies, and says this to people, right? Genesis 15:1, he says this to Abram. After these things, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision. Fear not, do not be afraid, Abram. I am your shield. Your reward shall be great. So Jesus is using all of these God statements to these folks so they understand that he is God in the flesh. Only God walks on the water. Only God can say I am. Only God can tell them, do not be afraid, right? And then he got into the boat with them, and the wind ceased, and they were utterly astounded. Another Greek word here, existanto. It's a great word, existanto, which means literally they were out of their minds or standing outside of themselves. Ex always means out, right? Statis, the other portion of the word, means standing. So they were standing outside of themselves. They just could not quite get it. They were like, oh my goodness, this is crazy. Why were they astounded here? Well, because Jesus is essentially answering a hanging question from the last time they were at the sea. Remember, we covered them being at sea and Jesus calming the storm before going to the country of Gerasenes. What did they ask Jesus? Who is this that even the winds and the waves obey him, right? That question was hanging out there. It took several chapters, but they are back on that same sea. And Jesus answers that question and says, I am, revealing his identity. He is the God of the Old Testament, that same God that actually walks on the sea. He's right here in the midst of this sea, walking on the sea. He's the God of the Old Testament in the flesh, right? For they did not understand about the loaves, but their hearts were hardened. See, they didn't get that he was doing these miracles. This 5,000 people plus people were being fed because their hearts were hardened. But they were getting a lesson in who this Yahweh was here on the Sea of Galilee. One quick ending note here, okay? There's a parallel story in Matthew's gospel that tells of Peter getting out of the boat, walking towards Jesus, right? He asked Jesus, can I come out and hang out with you on the water? And Jesus says, yes. They walk together back in the boat. Same incident, right? And the sea is calmed. It happens, the same incident. So Mark actually did not record Peter asking that question. Why is that, right? Well, Mark actually records this story from Peter's recollection, right? He traveled with Peter. So why wasn't Peter walking on water included? Now, if I walked on water and I'm Peter, I'm like giving him the story. I'm saying, hey, remember to tell him I walked on water with Jesus. That was pretty cool. That was actually pretty cool, right? Well, I think one word sums up why he didn't do it. Humility. And we see this throughout the Gospels from all of the disciples, from the Apostle Paul, Everybody walks in this type of humility because Paul, I think, or Peter, I think, wanted to focus on Jesus being the focus of the story, the actions of Jesus rather than his own actions. He didn't want to be the focal point. Again, like John the Baptist, he wanted to play a backup role, a bit actor role in this grand narrative of God's story. And I think this is a reminder of the humility that's necessary to walk as a follower of Jesus. May we all remember Peter's desire to keep the focus on Jesus in this text, even when he walked on water too. He could have asked Mark to record this, but he did not. And may we strive to do the same in our witness. Keep the focus on Jesus. All right, folks, that's been session number 23 of our exploration of the Gospel of Mark. Next up, we're going to move into session number 24. I can't wait. Grace and peace to you all.